Hello, everyone. This is your co-host, Stu, and I am here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Hi, Patty. How are you this evening?
Hi, Stu. How are you doing tonight? I'm doing pretty good.
Very well, and thanks for asking.
So tonight I wanted to kind of get back to my roots. I love vampires, werewolves, and monsters as much as the next guy, but I am at heart a ghost gal. So love being the ghost lady of PA, and I just wanted to get back to some ghost stories. So tonight I thought we would start with something that I've been following for years and years. In 2011, there was an earthquake in Japan. It was a terrible tsunami that came with it, and 15,000 people passed away. It's also what caused that nuclear reactor at Fukushima to melt down because of all of that. And afterward, there was complete silence for about 2 years. You didn't hear anything other than like they were doing their rescues and trying to help, treat people and what have you. But then the ghost stories began to trickle out. There was actually a book written of some of these ghost stories. And at first it was just a little bit of, hey, did you hear there were some ghosts that were sighted? And then eventually it came out that the people who were having the most experiences were the taxi drivers. They call them the taxi ghosts. So basically what happened was that after the worst of this is over, the whole area is completely flooded and it's just a horrible mess. And people came out and they were saying that they were seeing people's faces of people they recognized, or just their eyes looking out of mud puddles and up out of the ground at them. And then right after this happened, that's whenever the stories began about the taxis. So there was a British reporter by the name of Richard Parry who began telling these stories, and he called them the tsunami spirits, and then eventually he called them their taxi ghosts. So basically, I'll tell you a couple stories. So the first, Tabby, who explained his experience in the summer after the tsunami had hit, which would have been the summer of 2011. So a few months after it, there was, very few people still living in the area, very few customers around, and this was what he did for a living. This is all he knew how to do. So he was looking for fares, and he sees a young woman waving at him, trying to, get his attention. Well, he's kind of excited, frankly. He needed the money, and he could use the fare. So he pulls up, and he realizes she's wearing a heavy winter coat, but it's like the middle of summer and hot. And she's also soaking wet. Like she looks like she'd been in a terrible storm. So as he pulls up to her, he registers all of this in just a few seconds, and she opens the door and she gets inside the cab, and he's thinking, it hasn't rained in days here. How is this possible? So he says to her, where do you want to go? And she names a district, and he said, that was really badly messed up. It's almost empty. There's nothing there. Are you sure you want to go that direction? And she sat there for just a second as though pondering it, and then she looked at him and said, have I died? And he was like whirled around in the seat, and he's looking at her, and she's looking at him, and then all of a sudden she's gone.
Yep, she died. Wow, that's. I mean, we have the white lady stories here in Pennsylvania, but yeah, not that trumps it, man. To actually, see someone flagging down a cab and, actually getting in.
Yeah, the second one that I chose to tell, another one I heard that I thought was really interesting. Again, this is in Kudo. There's a cabbie who picks up a young guy who's in his mid-20s, and he gets in the car and he's looking very confused, like he's not sure what he's supposed to be doing. And the guy says to him, where are you headed? And he says, he names a mountainside park right outside the city, and he keeps pointing with his finger, like he wants to go that way. So the cabbie turns on the meter and he heads in the right direction, and he's like, that's a long haul. It's quite a drive. And the guy doesn't say anything. He just keeps pointing. So he pulls off, turns around to tell the guy how much the fare was, and there's nobody in the car.
How do you explain that to management?
Yeah. And I will tell you, much closer to home, because we had, from 9/11, we had all the sadness happened out in Western Pennsylvania. And when the plane went down. And I do know, literally, this is true. It was maybe 6, 10 months, something like that, after the Flight 93 went down, that this happened. And what happened is I had a friend of mine in Johnstown who called me, and she said, there's this guy who's working the Flight 93 site as a security guard. And he wants to talk to somebody. He's had something happen. And it was like something out of a movie. So like the arrangements were made that I would drive up to Cambria County, to this little town, go to the pizza shop, tell the guy at the front desk of the pizza shop, I came here to talk to so-and-so. So I did. And, it was raining and cold and miserable. It was a perfect night for this kind of craziness.
Mm-hmm.
So I pull in, and there's like 3 other cars in the parking lot. You can see the guys inside cleaning up, getting ready. It's 9 o'clock at night. Walk in, and I said, I'm here to talk to so-and-so. And they say, he's in the back room, and they point. So my friend's in the back room with this guy, big, burly bodybuilder type. And literally 2 days earlier in the local news, there had been this story that a local security company was run by 2 state cops, had taken over security at the Flight 93 crash site after the initial investigation was over. So it was no longer being monitored by the feds. And that they had multiple people quit or refused to go there because there had been experiences. And one of them had been a young reporter from Johnstown who had come to interview. It turned out to be the guy I'm now talking to. And she got it on video, on audio. Like, one of the stories was that you would hear footsteps coming up into this little trailer that had been used for housing the artifacts that were going to be shipped to DC. So like any bits of the plane, personal things that might have been found on the ground from the passengers, that sort of stuff. And they were boxed up and taken to this trailer, house trailer, where they were then stored until they were shipped wherever those ones were to go. And she caught, while she's standing there talking and this guy's recording her, her cameraman, you hear 4 steps of a person walking up the steps to the house, the house trailer, and then you hear footsteps in the house trailer walk right between her and the guy she's interviewing, but there's nobody there. And I actually interviewed her later, and she was like, that was the freakiest thing that ever happened. I thought it was a joke until I was there. So basically, there are stories from up there, and they started coming out within a few months of the place being returned over to local control. And I talked to this gentleman. He told me several stories. He told me that he was there for 21 nights, and each night there was a something. There was always this feeling of unrest, like discomfort inside that house trailer. Nobody liked to be in the house trailer. So he would sit in his car all night, and he would just drive around, make his rounds, get out where he had to walk, get back in his car, and there was this great big pole light. He'd pull up under the pole light, and he'd do like word searches between rounds just to stay awake. But he didn't like to go into the trailer because the trailer creeped him out. So one night he's sitting there, and it had been muddy and raining. First part of December. He was there for most of the month of December. And he's sitting in his car doing a word search, got the music on low, and he feels the back end of his car go down. And he jumps out of the car. It's like somebody hopped on the back of the car. Mm-hmm. And you can see that it's squatting like somebody's on the back of the car. And he's standing there trying to figure out if like the shocks broke or something's going on. And he's like, what the heck? And as he's doing this, he hears that sound of walking in mud, whenever you jump down on this muddy.
That squelching sound.
Yeah. He hears that, and the car's back end goes back up, and then he hears 3 or 4 steps through the mud, and it's gone. On another night, he was doing his rounds when he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a person sitting in the back seat. And the person said, "Is this all there is?" And he whirled around, jammed on the brakes, whirled around, and there was nobody in the car. The strangest story he told, and the one that was most powerful to him, and this is the one that made him decide to leave that job, was that he was sitting, it had snowed, it was toward the end of the month of December, and it had snowed, and everything was just that pretty white with the moonlight on it, very bright. And he's sitting there under that pole light, and he sees in the distance a person coming toward him through the field. Well, it was very well blocked off. It was extremely well blocked off. I was up there. And she's walking toward him, and he's like, "It's a female. It's a woman. She's got a baseball jersey on and blue jeans, no coat, and it's very chilly. It's like snowing, so it's very chilly." So he winds his window down, and he yells, "Hey, lady, what are you doing?" And she just keeps walking toward him. And he yells, "Ma'am, ma'am, what's going on?" And again, nothing. She gets about 20, 30 yards away. He has a light. He flashes it at her. He sees her face very clearly. And then she looks at him and just fades away. So that rattled him really bad. He gets home the next morning, and those who remember, there were a lot of memorial websites to the Flight 93 and what have you. Mm-hmm. So he gets on one of those, and he finds this woman, and he says to me, Inside Edition offered me money to tell this story, and I chose not to tell it to them. I don't want their money. And I said, "Well, why are you telling it to me?" And he said, "Because people that know you tell me you're an honest person and you can get the story out. I want their families to know some of those people on that plane never left. They're still up there. They need to go up and help them cross over. That's all I want, lady." And I did write a story that appeared in Fate magazine and got a lot of flack for it. But there are a lot of those such stories. There really are.
A lot of flack from whom?
Everybody under the sun, other writers. I wrote the story, and I literally recorded everything, and I wrote it verbatim. I did it like a transcript because I didn't want to change a word. I gave him my word that I would do it a certain way. So I didn't change anything, except like if he repeated something 3 or 4 times, I didn't add all 3 or 4 versions of it, because I wanted it to be his words. There was no way I could tell it nearly as powerfully as he did. But I had a lot of people like, "It's too soon. How dare you, making money off of this. How could it be?" And it wasn't true. This was done for that very reason. The only thing he asked of me was, "Can you get the story out so the families will know, and if they feel like they need to come and help them, they can." Because I think some of these people haven't left yet. And that was the purpose of it from the first moment I started that story till the end of that story. But yeah, I got a lot of flack. People that still to this day don't talk to me about it, and that were writers and friends of mine.
Yeah, I guess from my point of view, looking at a situation like that, I would be exhilarated, I think. But I mean, because they're just people,
right?
And what harm's going to come from just people, unless there was like some serial killer on the plane that went down, but I don't think there were. But that's just. Yeah, I guess if you're not used to or not looking for that sort of thing and it happens to you, then it can be unnerving.
Well, he was pretty mellow about it. And he told me right up front, he's like, "Dude, I am not that guy. I don't run around looking for dead people. Like, I'm a bodybuilder. I'm a muscle man. That's my world. I took this job because it allowed me to work nights and I could do the stuff I needed to during the day, and had no intention of running into dead people. But this is what happened, and I thought about it, and I think their families need to know." And that was from the beginning of that conversation to the last time I spoke to the man, what he wanted to have happen, and that's what I made happen. But even other writers that write ghost stories were really upset with me. I got a lot of flack from several different writers. It was what it was, and I still don't regret doing it. I think it was the right thing.
It sounds like a good thing to do. I mean, especially if that's what the gentleman wanted.
It's what he wanted. He believed that some of these people might need to go home. He was very circumspect. He refused Inside Edition, several other news magazines that were on at the time. He didn't even tell me the name of the lady he saw. He said he knows who she is, and he wouldn't tell anybody except if her particular family would contact him and say, was it her? He's like, I'll tell them. And I never asked. It wasn't for me to know. So, I mean, a lot of other tragic events, foster these stories. From 9/11 in New York City, there are stories. There are stories about a African-American woman in a Red Cross outfit who is seen walking along. The Red Cross outfit's from like the 1950s, and she's got a tray of sandwiches, and she's been seen by a lot of the first responders that were there going through. It's not just at the very beginning, but like they've spent a year sifting through all of that, and people that were working that case the whole way through, multiple people saw this woman, and she would just walk up toward them and then just disappear. She's even been seen at the landfill where some of that stuff ended up after they started clearing it all out.
Mm-hmm.
Who she was, no one knows, but there is some speculation that she was a soul catcher. She was there to help guide people over.
So she wasn't ever seen there before?
No,
the
not to
events of
anybody's
9/11.
knowledge. But from the time they started, not necessarily the first day when it was so chaotic, but from the time they started sorting through all of that a few days later, first responders were there. Sometimes some of the same people were there for the entire year. I cannot imagine the damage to their psyche that had to have been there for an entire year. God bless them. God love them. I hope they made it through okay, because I cannot imagine having to do what they did. But there's several times that she was seen by multiple people on multiple occasions. So there's those kinds of stories. As you said, we have ladies in white. Lady in white stories are very, very common. But I found one that I've heard one here that I thought was really interesting. So this was in Vermont. So this couple was driving along. It was evening, and they were going out on a date. So they're about 18-year-old kids. And as they're driving down this little country road, all of a sudden, the guy who's driving, he looks over because his girlfriend starts to scream, like, "Oh my God, watch out!" He thought she saw a deer. And he whirls his head over, and what he sees is a woman in a white dress, and she's pushing a little white bassinet with like a baby bassinet. And beside her, there's a little boy, and she's holding his hand. And he's also wearing like little white knickers and a little white shirt. And as they're sitting there watching, for just a second, he paused as he slammed the brakes on. They're right there ahead of him, and then he hits the gas a little bit, and as he's going past them, he's looking at them. When he looks up into the rearview mirror to see if they're still there, they're not there. And he said he's always wondered his whole life. He's like, I don't know what I saw. I only know that I saw this. And it was just the most amazing thing, because, how often do you see a lady pushing a bassinet and walking with a little child down an old country road at, 8 or 9 o'clock at night? It's not something that happens too often. That's one of the stories that I thought was really interesting. A police officer told this story, and I thought I'd share this with you. So, being a police officer, you get all kinds of cases. There's Pittsburgh, I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but the prison in Pittsburgh is said to be haunted. There's a cell in Pittsburgh in the old prison that is supposedly very haunted. And how the prison is built is the prison's on one side of the street, the courthouse is on the other side, and they built a walkway called the Bridge of Woes. And so you can take them from the jail and walk them across the Bridge of Woes into the courthouse to go to court. And then you can walk them back, so you not dragging them across the street at the pedestrian level. And there are so many stories about a phantom that walks the Bridge of Woes, about this one cell where people go crazy when they're in it. There's tons of those stories, but this one I thought caught my attention because it was just so interesting. So this guy's working. It's a mid-sized little town. They got a little county jail, and he's booking a guy for domestic violence. Guy's kind of belligerent and mouthing off, you know how they are when they're a little bit drunk and they think they're right. So he's booking this guy, and he's going through the process, and there's like 5 or 6 cells, and he's doing it, he notices this short guy. He's a kind of white. He's a white man, and he's got like what they used to call wife beater t-shirts, you know, the ones with the straps, and a pair of pants on, and he's kind of glaring at him. Little pudgy guy, mid-40s probably, and he's kind of glaring at this cop who's booking the domestic violence guy, and the guy's giving a little bit of lip. So after they get this fella done through the, you know, fingerprinting and get his statement and all that stuff, he walks by this guy in the first cell that's been staring at him, and he's like trying not to make eye contact because he doesn't want the guy to ask for something or start screaming, I want this or that, right? He just wants to park this dude, let him sober up, and go about his business. So he gets through there. He goes down to the end of the little cell block, and he locks this guy in the cell, comes back up, walks right past the guy, and the guy's still just standing there staring at him, dead-eyed. And he's ignoring him and trying not to make eye contact, go on out and do his job. So he's at his desk, and his boss calls him, the police chief, and he's like, hey, I need you to do the bookkeeping for the little cell block out there. So what you do is you have to count the intakes and make sure that everybody's accounted for. And he counted heads, and he counted the paperwork, and according to the paperwork, there wasn't anybody in cell 1. But he's like, no, I clearly saw this guy in cell 1. And he goes out, he looks, and there's nobody in cell 1. So he starts talking to the other cops. He's like, hey, did you guys transfer him somewhere? Did you guys cut him loose? What's going on? And they're like, we didn't see anybody in cell 1. And he's like, no, come on now. There was somebody in cell 1. Well, there's cameras. So he decides to go pull the camera and see the footage. And sure enough, you see the domestic violence guy being all belligerent, and you see them doing the whole thing. You see the guy in cell 1 standing there, just staring. Like I said, that dead fish-eyed look kind of thing, staring. And you see the cop walk by, put the guy in the cell at the end of the block. You see him walk back up past this guy and head out off the frame because he's going into a next room where his office is. And just like a bubble popping, the guy standing in cell 1 just, whoop, and he's gone. And he said, my chief looked at it, and he said, what do you think of that? And he said, I don't know what to think of that. And he said, me either. Let's not talk about it. And he said it took a lot of years before he was able to, you know, to talk about it. And here in Bedford, we had something sort of a similar. There used to be a flower shop here in town that had a great big apartment above it. And for years, the cops would get these calls. There's motion sensors in the shop that would, you know, ring up in the police station to let them know that somebody was in there. And they get armed at night whenever the staff would leave. And he would go in and he would look around. And he said one night he was looking around, and it was originally an old mansion. And they split it up into like a big apartment, and the first floor was a business, the flower shop. So he's like, I got a call. I was the only dude out that night. So I thought, well, I better go over and take a look at the flower shop. There was never anybody there. It had become kind of routine. You go in, you turn off everything, you make sure everything's locked again, you leave. So he goes in with his flashlight, and he does his thing. He's getting through all that, kind of looking around like, you know, do due diligence. And that's when he sees him. It's an older gentleman in clothes from about the turn of the 20th century, maybe just before. And he's, you know, suit on, very thin, elderly man. And he's walking up the steps. And he said, I could see him clearly. And I yelled, hey, who are you? Hey. And he said, guy never paid me any attention. So I started up the steps. I got up about 4 steps, and he was just gone. So he pulled the camera footage later, and he said, I have to tell you, Patty, I wish I would have known you back then. I'd have saved it, but I erased it because I didn't want to be the one that saw the dead guy. He told me, he said, that place there, he's like, that's the one place in town I can guarantee you there's ghosts. And that's because he saw them himself. So I wanted to tell a story that a lady came to talk to me years ago at a book signing, and I thought this was a fascinating story, so I'm going to share it. So she was working a road crew for the county, and, you know, she was the flagger. So she's got her little walkie-talkie, and she's got the radio thing that they hold that they, you know, talk back and forth into. And they're out on a rural road. So every so many miles, they put a porta potty. They move the porta potty every so often. But where she was at, it was like over a half a mile walk to the porta potty. And she didn't have that much time. She have to get somebody else to pull off the line to do the flagging for 5 minutes while you go to the bathroom, right? So the guys had been using, there was a little old abandoned cemetery there, and they would up and behind the cemetery into the woods, and they'd go to the bathroom. She's like, well, I just have to pee. So she calls somebody over. She's like, dude, I got to go pee. Give me about 5 minutes. So she goes up behind the cemetery, climbs up into the trees back in there where she's sheltered, and begins to take care of things. And all of a sudden, her radio bursts into static, and she hears what sounds like words, garbled words coming through. And she's like, that's just really weird. So she turns the radio off so that she hears the click. And she's finishing up when all of a sudden the static bursts out of the radio again. And she gets, help, help, help me. And it's a woman. And then more static. And she looks at the radio and she can see it's clearly off. The light's off. That indicates it's on. She turns it on, and then she turns it back off, and she kind of books it hell for leather down back out of that cemetery. And over the course of about the next 3 or 4 days, she has the same experience multiple times. And she said, you know, the thing that creeped me out the most was the fact that I was the only woman working that crew. There should have been nobody else around. There was no houses within a couple miles. There was no phone lines or anything running through there. It was just an old road that needed some repairs. And she said, I even thought maybe there was something wrong with the radio, so I swapped out radios for a brand new one and still had the same experience. So to share another story like that, there's a police officer who was, this is a rural area, so I've you know, talked to lots of police officers over the years that have worked in the woods. Like you cruise around, you do your tour, and it will often include long stretches of woods. And so this guy like pulls off the road. He's out in a rural area, and he had to go back this one road to this warehouse. They'd had some problems with it being broken into. So he decided, you know, I'll pull back there. I got to go pee. I'll get out of the car. I'll take my flashlight, shine it around, step out into the weeds, go pee, get back in my car. We're all good. There were no cars in the parking lot, no lights on anywhere. He's just doing his job. So he gets out of the car, shines his lights around. He doesn't see anything wrong. None of the doors are unlocked. All the chains are in place. Everything's good in this old warehouse. Not a problem. So he steps behind his car out into the weeds, and he begins to take care of his business. When all of a sudden he sees a shadow of a person moving right along the tree line. Well, his thoughts are maybe there's the landowner for the property that's bordering this is out, saw the lights flashing and wanted to know what was going on. And he yells, hey, whoever this is, who are you? Identify yourself. And he quickly, you know, gets everything put together, and he grabs his light. There's nobody there. But he saw like a shadow darker than darkness moving. And so he gets back over to his car, and he's like, this doesn't make any sense. I completely saw this. He's sure of it. So he's standing there by the car door, and he's looking around, and he sees the brush moving. And he's like, okay, that's it. It's a person. So he yells, hey, come out. And just as he yells this thing steps out of the brush and into the swath of his light. And he's like, it was a person, but it was a see-through person. I could see completely through them. And he's like, I couldn't tell you if it was a man or a woman. It was just the shape of a human. And he said, the figure began moving toward me. I jumped into the car. I didn't know what this was. I just knew it wasn't a person. And I took off.
Not a living person at any rate.
Yeah, not a living person. Whatever it wasn't a living person. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And I've always thought about that. I wondered what that was. Because, you know, I'm going to tell another story. This one's actually when it happened to somebody I'm very close to. So one of my family members took a job a couple years ago where he was a security guard at night. The company had staff there in the daytime to watch this place. It was a big old mill, and it was still in operation at that time. And it was, I bet you, a good 1/10 of a mile long, because it was like built in sections as the place got bigger and needed more, you know, so it was built in sections. And then there was this little building at the front of it, almost making a T shape for the building. And he was stationed in this front room, and he's, you know, working at night. And there's this great big panoramic window in front of him, so you can see cars coming and going and all that good stuff. You're supposed to lock the door, watch the monitors. Once every 2 hours, you go out, walk through the whole building, which was creepy as crap at night, and back into your office. And you lock the door and you watch the monitors, and you do this repeatedly until the night is over. And he said to me that, like, he was only there maybe 2 weeks. And he said, you know, you hear footsteps walking behind you. You see shadows darting around. He's like, it's creepy. So he asked somebody that worked there with, you know, came in and relieved him, if anybody there ever saw anything. And the guy was like, dude, it's a business. There's people that have dropped dead of heart attacks. There was a guy that was shot down here by his wife's boyfriend. And it's going on with all these different things that happened. He's like, yeah, there's people that's died here. Yeah, we hear stuff. We just don't look too close because it's not human, you know? So this one particular night, he had been really rattled, and he said, called me at the middle of the night. It was probably 2 o'clock in the morning. And he's like, I'm seeing this big black shadow, and it came out of the wall and it ruffled the calendar. So he's sitting at his desk looking out that big window and watching the monitors, when all of a sudden the lights begin to flicker, and he looks into the corner between him and the doorway. There's this mass, black mass, that suddenly appears, and it's getting larger as it coalesces. And he's thinking, how do I get past it to the door and get out of here? And it comes at him, and it hit the calendar, skewed the calendar, ruffled the pages. It had mass. That's terrifying. If it has mass, it can hurt you. And he waits till it comes over close, and he starts praying, literally praying. And he said it sort of paused. And at that point, he said, I got the feeling it was hateful. It didn't want me to it wanted me to shut up. And it kind of went up through the ceiling and just was gone. And that's when he called me, and he's like, you got to come. I'm terrified. I don't know anybody else that might believe me. So I get into my car. It's the middle of the night. This is a young guy, you know, and I get over there, and I said, well, I'll sit in front of the window in my car, and that way you'll see me. You'll know there's somebody here with you. And I'm thinking, to be honest, he's young, he's spooked. He's going to be imagining this to some extent. So I'm sitting there, and I'm doing little prayers and, you know, what have you. And he would call me on the phone every so often. And then all of a sudden, I see right outside that room on the roof, this black mass start to appear. And it comes floating down, slams into that window that he's sitting behind, through the window. And at that point, I hear him scream, do you see it? Do you see it? And I'm like, oh my God, get out of there. There really is something there. And it was the creepiest feeling I've ever had. I mean, there's only one thing that was creepier than that, and it was the story I tell about that cemetery. But it was that kind of intense fear. And he could come barreling out. He quit his job that night, and I followed him home. He called his boss in the morning, and his boss said to him, you've got to be kidding me. He said, this is crazy. And then his other boss called him. There was 2 men who ran the company. And he said, you're the 4th guy to quit because he saw that. I don't know what it was. The company went bankrupt very shortly thereafter, and the place is being torn down currently. But it's quite a tale.
Especially since you confirmed what he saw.
Yeah, I really was thinking, okay, he's really spooked himself. He's kind of worked himself up. let's go through this process. I did prayers because I knew that would be calming and what have you. But I was concerned enough to go drive over and sit with him. That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then I saw it too. Yeah. So it was quite a experience.
Bigger than a person?
Yes. This thing had to be 8 or 9 feet high, just this huge mass. It wasn't a person shape. It was just a mass of black.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that definitely bigger than a person. So
Any idea what that was?
I think it was evil. I don't know how, I don't know if it's say demonic, but whatever it was a very negative entity. Like, it scared the bejeebers out of me enough that I screamed, just get out now. Come sit in the car with me. And when he got out there, he said, I'm going, I'm done, I quit. And he got in his car and he said, follow me home, and I did.
Makes you wonder, I mean, if he was the fourth person, at least they told he was the fourth person that actually potentially reported it, you know.
Yeah.
And nobody was harmed yet.
I don't think people stayed after the first time they saw it, as a general rule.
Yeah, probably, but I mean, after they.
He said he felt.
Yeah, hindsight's 20/20. Yeah.
Yeah. He said he felt terrified and that it was coming for him, and that's when he began doing the prayers.
Mm-hmm.
And then it stopped. He said, I could feel it was angry, and then it shot through the ceiling that first night. And I thought, okay, well, maybe he saw something, but maybe it wasn't as bad as all that. So, you know, and then in the middle of the night, I told him, if things get bad again, let me know. And so he did, and I did promise I would help, and so I went over. Yeah, it was just one heck of a thing to see. And it was dark. It was like darker than darkness. It was black, whatever it was. And I don't think it had any good intentions.
Yeah, we don't usually associate the dark color black like that with anything happy.
No, not at all. So, so I have one more story I would like to tell, and this one actually came from a gentleman I knew who was literally my landlord once, a long time ago. And he came to my house one day and he said, hey, are you interested in a job? I'll pay you. It was an exorbitant amount of money back then. It was like 20 some bucks an hour at a time when the minimum wage was like $5. And I said, what do I have to do for this? You know, kind of a thing. And he said, well, he's like, people don't realize it, but he worked for a security agency. And apparently in the area, there were businesses that bought old, empty, like, factories, and they turned them into warehouses to store their stuff. And there was a business up in that in Blair County there that had a great big old sewing factory, and this had become a big warehouse for several companies. They stored their overflow stuff there, so they had a security guard there at night so nobody could break in, because there were literally millions of dollars worth of goods in this old factory. And it had a freight elevator, and it had all the electric was still on and everything. So it was intact and workable. And the elevator was so old. The elevator was built in 1900, and it was one of those elevators that you had to kind of like fluctuate it to get it to get level with the floor.
Mm-hmm.
So you manually did it. You didn't. It wasn't like you hit a button and it just automatically did its thing. You had to manually do it in the freight elevator. So he said to me, he said, you're not afraid of ghosts and stuff. He said, you can't be. So I'd be willing to pay you, because I think this is your kind of gig. And I'm like, so you're telling me it's haunted? And he's like, I'm telling you, it's really haunted. Mm. And it's mostly haunted by this one guy who, there were two different things that were seen there. There was a guy who was seen walking like very fast, as though he was busy and in a hurry. And he freaked out the security guards, because he'd walk right past them and then just disappear. And the other was the freight elevator, because it would turn itself on, come down to the 7th floor, open the doors, and there would be a man laying on a gurney there, and nobody else there. So not just the guy on a gurney, and then it would just disappear. So after a while, I didn't take the job, because frankly, I didn't want to be stuck alone in a big old empty building all night long by myself. I'm too chicken for that. Sorry. It just didn't sound like my cup of tea. If I could wire the building and have my friends with me and we could all ghost hunt together, that's an awesome thing. But yeah, the idea of padding through this empty building all night long waiting for somebody to break in just didn't appeal to me, even at that price. So I started asking around, though, and I found a couple people who used to work at this particular sewing factory who told me the same story. And they told me at different times, so it wasn't like they were kind of getting together to make it up. And that was, they had described the man to me, the security officer had described the man to me in some detail. His family still lives in the area. I won't go into any description. They might recognize it. So I'm being deliberately vague here. But they knew this guy, and they described him to me. And he had died of a heart attack on the freight elevator while they were trying to get it to go down to meet the ambulance years and years earlier. And that's exactly what they said. They said even whenever it was still a factory, a sewing factory, that would happen. From time to time, the elevator would take on a life of its own and come down to the 7th floor, which is where it stopped to pick him up. And he would be on there laying on this gurney thing and disappear. So they as soon as I mentioned the place, they're like, oh, it's haunted. And I'm like, really? And then they started telling me the stories. The nice thing about being the ghost lady is everybody wants to tell you a ghost story. So that's my ghost stories for tonight, but I have a special treat. So we've been asking folks to, ask us questions for the Q&A or send us some stories and stuff like that. There's a lady named Patty. I don't want to use her last name, but she sent me this amazing story that I wanted to share and to let other people know that if you want to share stories with us, we want to share them with everybody else, as long as you are okay with it. I asked her for permission. And like I said, I won't use her last name, but I wanted to read you some of what she had written to me. So she was telling me about a house she lived in a long time ago. And this is how it started. So she says, here goes. I lived in a home built in 1806 for over 25 years. It was a huge colonial with 12 rooms and barn. When we moved in, weird things started to develop. Fresh bread smells in the kitchen, lights on when we weren't home, and my cellar door that was off my dining room would open, etc. I had 3 children, and my husband was a merchant marine, and it was gone 2 to 3 months at a time. As time went on, we would hear someone walking up and down the stairs, or walking down from upstairs at night, a voice mimicking my children's, calling me inside and outside of the home. Cigar and lavender smells, and a strange noises coming from the basement. It got to be a point where my children and I all had experiences. My children saw 2 young children swinging on an old swing from a huge tree in front of my house. 2 small children, all in white, in my bedroom at night. My daughter was so scared of the dark that all lights had to be on upstairs at night, and she wouldn't even go upstairs alone, even in the daylight. Mind you, she was only about 4 years old. One bedroom upstairs had a lot of activity. My oldest daughter had it first, and she was always scared in that room. She said she would see a shadow in her room, and she heard it in the hallway, and she woke some mornings with scratches on her back. When my son took over the room, he would be up late at night studying, and he said on several occasions an old woman dressed in period clothing would be in his room. He swears by this and saw her numerous times. He described her to a T. She never spoke to him till one day. He still talks about her and how haunted our home was. They all have numerous stories about the house. We sold the house in 2019 and moved out of state. As I was preparing the home for sale, I was doing some floors over. Now, to understand this, the history of the home was that an eye doctor had an office up the back stairs of the house on the 2nd floor, and this small room had a sink and cupboards like a summer kitchen. Off that room was a small hallway that led to my bedroom. We never used that room except for storage. It had old paneling and a green carpet on the floor. When I decided to paint the walls and remove the carpeting, I found something that startled me. When ripping the carpet up, it had some padding under it, then what looked like brown paper bag flooring, and underneath the wooden floor. As I got to the one section along the wall, there was a huge dark patch that went through the brown paper onto the padding that wasn't wet to the touch. The floor felt almost spongy, but not wet. The stain followed the wall right up to the entryway. I cleaned the floor as I was going to stain it, and I wished that I had thought to take pictures of it first. I contacted my daughter and son as to what I had discovered, and oh my goodness, they both said, "Mom, that is a blood stain," and sent me pictures to show me what old blood stains look like on a wooden floor. I was horrified. I did take the pictures of the floor after I'd stained over it, and the stain did not go away. So it was darker than the stain she used. So my question to you is, what do you think or feel this old woman was trying to tell us? Something. She never harmed us. I felt she was a protector. She lived with us all those years, and I feel like she showed me this so that I would understand why she was there, and something happened in that room, and I needed to discover it. So many things, good and bad, happened in the house while we lived there, and so many more stories could be shared. The house was connected to an old barn that we converted into a garage, and there were numerous chew marks from horses opening, from the horses in opening the ceiling for the bales of hay. At night, if you were in the barn, you would experience what sounded like wolves doing laps outside the door and growling, like they were pacing in front of the garage door. A handprint appeared on the outside of the pane of glass on a new window we installed, and no matter how many times I washed it, it kept reappearing. Weird stuff. Now, this home is on a main road in a small town in Maine and not out in the woods. We had over 2 acres and neighbors nearby. And she asked me for my thoughts. And I have to tell you, I thought it was a fantastic story. She left a couple more clues with us in the second set of emails. She said, one night prior to our leaving, my oldest daughter came for a visit. As we were in the living room just finishing up a movie about a haunting, she pulled up on her phone the actual real sound effect from YouTube of this exorcism. We sat there on 2 separate couches, stunned by what happened. Then within 5 minutes of playing that sound, something rushed down the stairs, through the hallway, into my living room, pushed through my daughter's legs that were hanging off the couch, ran around the entire living room, out through the doorway, and vanished. It sounded like a rumbling along the walls. Even our cat was wide-eyed and stared at the walls in disbelief. We both froze, couldn't speak, and to this day I cannot explain what it was. I have no logical explanation as to what happened or what it could have been. By far the scariest thing I personally encountered firsthand. And then she continued to share a few little vignettes. I think this was a fantastic story. It is an anatomy of a family living with a haunting. Over the course of time, they made allowances, they chronicled it, they never let it get beyond their control. Why I did answer her privately as to what I thought was going on. But the one thing I would like people to take away from this story, aside from the fact that it's a lovely story, is that they did not allow fear to override them. They managed it. And if you live in a place that's haunted, or you find yourself in a place that's haunted, it is vital that you remain calm, as these folks did. And I thank Patty for her story and for letting us share it with everybody else. And with that, I am done.
Okay, that was a good one.
It was, wasn't it?
It was. So if our listeners and viewers have enjoyed this, if you're watching it on YouTube, please click the subscribe button down below. Click the bell so that you get notified when we release new content. We have our Facebook groups, Paranormalist Podcast, and the Paranormalist Group Share. Yeah, it took me a second there. The links for everything will be down below. And again, the email address, which did get used by Patty, and that's paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. Send us your stories, your questions for a Q&A, and I think this is going to be the last time I'm going to ask.
So come on, guys. If you've been thinking about it, now's the time.
So, and with that, that's all the paperwork stuff that I have to do. So, okay. Back to you, my dear.
Good night, Stu. Good night, everybody.